Hello, everyone. Welcome to Thursday. It's February 4th, 2021. Well, as we head into the tail end of the week, we have finally seen the weather pattern change after the very mild spring-like weather to start the week. Things really started to get interesting and colder yesterday with that wintry weather and that Pacific cold front. Certainty and uncertainty continues with this Arctic air mass that we've been talking about, for better than a week now. I wish I could tell you that we've got things nailed down. We have things nailed down a little bit better, but we still have a lot of question marks going forward. The Arctic boundary is going to be tricky to nail down. A lot of folks who listen and watch this podcast in southeastern Wyoming, western Nebraska, and the eastern plains and the front range of Colorado, that's where this is a real problem. This is where trying to figure out where the Arctic air is going to go in that area is where we have the most concern. Where you go further north into Montana, northern and central and northeastern Wyoming, western South Dakota, into North Dakota, into the northern areas of Nebraska, it's a foregone conclusion. You're going to get the Arctic air and the snow. It's those areas I mentioned at the beginning where there's going to be a problem, because what will happen is when you're right on these Arctic air boundaries, you have fluctuating temperatures, fluctuating conditions. 1 minute you could be 40 degrees, the next minute you could be 20. It's that type of situation. We do see snow in this pattern. It's not going to get really heavy on the plains. We still see a good snow pattern for the mountains, but there's going to be some slick roads at times, especially in those northern areas this weekend and next week. Now, next week, we do see signs again that the cold may push, this Arctic air may push more south, a little west, and get deeper next week across the north central areas of the United States. And we'll show you that here in a minute. This is what a lot of weather forecasters are doing right now, including myself, here in the Intermountain West and the Western High Plains. It's like, what is this Arctic air going to do? These are always really tricky situations. So yes, we are pulling our hair out. And you're probably doing the same when you watch these podcasts, wondering, well, what is going to go on? He keeps saying the Arctic air is going to come, or it's not, or it's going to be somewhere in between. So yes, we're pulling out our hair. Where is the Arctic air? Right now, this is where it's at. And you can see that there's a little bit of a wedge, kind of like a dagger, coming on in here. This is where the really, really cold air is. You're going to see some extremely cold temperatures up here in the coming days along the north slope of Alaska and the Northwest Territories. Where you see the pink here is where you're getting into the really cold, deep air. So right now, it's all still mostly north of the Canadian border, though some of the Arctic air is now leaking into North Dakota. This is what it looks like in the upper levels by Saturday morning. We have the high up into the Gulf of Alaska, which is going to open the door to Canada and allow that cold air to come on in. And you can see the vortex of cold is elongated. Kind of looks like a peanut here. And this is important because as this pattern unfolds, why we're having such a difficult time trying to get a grasp of this Arctic air is that the Arctic air mass that is kind of in two lobes here, two separate lobes, is going to separate. And then these lobes are going to want to rotate counterclockwise a little bit. Some of the models want to keep these two separate. Some want to merge them into one. And when you do that, you're going to move air masses around and make it really, really tricky. Now, a lot of times when we get these polar vortexes, they're not stretched out north-south like this. They're usually more in an east-west situation, which does make the weather forecasting a little bit easier. But as the pattern unfolds, this large area of extremely cold air is going to get broken about into two pieces. Then it's going to want to become one piece again. And as we go forward, you're going to see that. Now, this is by Saturday morning. The Arctic air deepens, and we're starting to see that Arctic push get into the northern Great Lakes and the Plain States. The coldest of cold air is still back up into here, but you see the pink? It's stretching out and pushing further south and east, but only just getting into Montana and the Dakotas by Saturday morning. We could probably call this the boundary here of the really cold air. And this is what we will see with temperatures on the surface by Saturday morning. These are predicted temperatures in Fahrenheit. You can see we're at the 0 point or below, pretty far north up to here. But notice it's in the teens. It's pretty cold up here near that boundary. And then we're going to call this the Chinook zone. from just about Wheatland, Wyoming, south along the I-25 corridor, and into the areas here where the high plains, the altitudes are a little bit higher. Notice the cold air Saturday morning isn't there yet. By Sunday, well, the sub-zero temperatures are about where they were Saturday morning. That Arctic air is basically just being held at bay. And look at the Chinook zone. See these temperatures here, upper 30s and lower 40s? You can divide the panhandle of Nebraska right along the North Platte River. In fact, the North Platte River, a lot of times, is where these Arctic air masses will sometimes stall and stop. And I think that North Platte River Valley is really showing up here on the modeling for Sunday morning. So essentially what we're looking at is the Arctic air gets into the northern areas over the weekend, but may have a hard time pushing past the North Platte Valley as there's just a little bit of a westerly wind pushing its way that way. Now, the west to northwesterly breezes that are coming in are laden with moisture. So there's going to continue to be snow in the mountains along this boundary here. So the snow in the mountains will do well. Out over the Arctic air here, there's going to be some light snow falling as that Pacific moisture hits that Arctic air. But this is what always makes us pull our hair out. This is the next graphic. This is a different computer model. This is actually called the Icon model out of Germany. It is showing temperatures going below zero through the North Platte Valley all the way to the Colorado-Nebraska border by noon on Sunday. So this is what always makes you nervous. And what makes you nervous about these situations like this is that Arctic air, once given the opportunity to move, it will, and it's hard to stop. So we are thinking more along these lines, that the Arctic air will be held back to the northern areas through the weekend. This may be an aberration. It's a computer model. You got to take it with a grain of salt, but we've got to show you this because this is always on the table with these Arctic air masses. So if you wake up Sunday morning in the Front Range of southeastern Wyoming and northeastern Colorado and it's foggy and all of a sudden you feel it getting colder, well, you know what happened there. Or you're in this situation where we hold off that Arctic air a little bit longer. Now, how long can we keep that Arctic air at bay? Now, I mentioned to you that the Arctic air was going to split into two pieces. We've got this piece here and another piece that's actually forecasted to go west and drift into the north slope of Alaska. Alaska could be looking at severe bitter cold next week if that happens. This area of Arctic air is very impressive, and notice there's a western extension of that Arctic air. Well, what will happen if this coalesces into a east-west type of Arctic air mass is that there's little disturbances that go counterclockwise around it that will send surges of Arctic air on the ground south into the region. This would likely allow some Arctic air to also spill west of the continental divide if this happens. Now, what will happen also with these Arctic air masses is they'll wobble. They'll wobble this way, they'll wobble that way, it'll wobble this way, it'll wobble that way. Arctic air is extremely heavy and more dense and close to the ground. So to move it, you need some type of storm or front to displace it. And so when these things wobble like that, and if you're on the Arctic boundary, which is going to be right here by then, well, that's where here in the Rocky Mountain West, for folks listening in Wyoming, Montana, or Colorado, or South Dakota, and Nebraska, it is really, folks, going to all depend on where you live. Now, if you were to look at the forecast through Tuesday night into Wednesday morning, you can see the Arctic air has spread back west of the divide up into Canada and is now pushed up to the areas along and near the divide along the Colorado Front Range and the Front Range of southeastern Wyoming. And over 10 days, the forecast through next weekend for the lower 48 is for most areas of the United States to be really cold. You notice, though, along and west of the divide is the dividing line between the really cold air and the warmer air here. So hopefully tomorrow we'll get a little bit of a better focus, but that's how things are shaping up with this Arctic air mass. It is certainly, by far, the worst of the cold is going to be in this area right here. That's where they're going to really notice the coldest of the cold. For folks living in this area here is where the most uncertainty is going to be. Snowfall-wise over the next 10 days, where that Arctic boundary wants to set up, you can see that there's going to be some pretty good snows. Look at the lake effect snows in the Great Lakes as that Arctic air covers and moves into the open waters of the Great Lakes. We are also going to see good amounts of snow continuing up into the high country. So a lot going on. Should prove to be interesting if you're a weather watcher over the next week or so. Thanks for watching and listening. We'll talk to you